Welcome to the UPoker Academy, designed to make you a better poker player. This lecture is going to cover ranges. Now, a range is, in a way, the potential hands that you could have. So, for example, in poker you have a hand, say you've got ace-queen. Now, you're going to raise that hand, and even though you've got ace-queen, your opponents don't know you've got ace-queen. What they know is that you've got a hand that you raised. So that might look like something like this. Pocket aces, kings, queens, jacks, tens, nines, eights, or ace-jack, ace-queen, ace-king. You notice ace-queen is in here, but so are a lot of other hands. So what that means is that your range that they put you on is going to be different than your specific hand. It's going to either be stronger or weaker. So let's say they have ace-jack, and they know you have a range of hands. In this case, ace-jack is slightly behind at about 42%. Of course, against ace-queen itself, it's significantly behind at just about 26% to win. So, given your range, somebody with ace-jack might decide to play with you, only being slightly behind, even though in this particular case they're very behind. So how this works in a real game is, anytime you're asked to make a decision, you're going to take into account your range and your opponent's range. For example, if I have 10 big blinds and I have something like queen-jack, let's pick queen-jack out of this. This is PokerStove. It's a really important piece of software. Let me just type in queen-jack. It's a really important piece of software to help you analyze ranges and determine how good your hand is against ranges. It's a little too clumsy to be used live at the table, but you should be using it off the table to identify what decisions you made right so that going forward you can make better decisions. So I've got queen-jack, and my opponent has gone all in. I've got 10 big blinds. So essentially I'm going to need to be about 46 or 47% against his range to call this here. Now if we knew he had ace-king, we'd fold, but we don't. He might have a range that's pretty large. He might be going all in a lot. Or he might have a range that's really narrow. So the question is, at what point does queen-jack become, about 50% to win? And let's take a look at 11.5% to start with. Against this range, we're at about 33%. So if we thought our opponent was going all in with good hands, so ace-9 or better, ace-10, pocket 7s or better, then we would know we'd fold queen-jack. And if he was going in with a lot of hands, top 2/3 of his hands, well, then we would call because we're at 56%. So somewhere between 11% and 60% is the point where it's profitable to call with queen-jack. This is the break-even point. And it's probably something like this. So this is the top 54.6% of hands. It's not the exact range somebody would go all in. If somebody would go all in with 3s, they're going to go all in with 2s, so we can manually add that. Most people aren't going to go in with weak queens or weak jacks, so why don't we take a couple of those out of their range, maybe 9-5. And this could be a reasonable shoving range here. And against this range, we're still at about 50%. So, given that we know our opponent's range, we can calculate what hands we need to call with. Let's say instead of queen-jack we had queen-9, then we'd only be about 46% to win. So just taking off a couple of points on the kicker really hurts our hand a lot. So, range calculations are crucial to everything you do in poker. For example, let's look at a hand I recently played. In this hand I had ace-4 suited, and I'm actually going to type this in manually because I had ace of spades, 4 of spades. And I had two opponents. One had 6 of spades, 6 of diamonds, and one had ace of diamonds, king of clubs, I believe it was. Alright, now we didn't get this all in pre-flop, but had we gotten all in pre-flop, who do you think would win? And the answer is going to be the 6s, because 6 against ace-king, the 6s are already ahead, and we've got one of the ace-king's outs, so they're going to be slightly ahead. Here they are at about 51%. But we didn't get this all in pre-flop. What happened was we had a board that was 4 of clubs, and instead of typing it in, you can also select it here. So we had 4 of clubs, and then 2, 2, and one of them was a spade. Yeah. And we didn't get it all in here either. As you can see here, we were pretty far behind. Actually, on the flop, so it was raised by ace-king before the flop, and we called. On the flop, it was checked through, so we weren't asked to bet or call any amount of money. But on the turn, something interesting happened. It was the 5 of spades. Now, the 5 of spades gives us our flush draw to the nuts with the 2 and 5 of spades. It also gives us, we thought, our draw to the aces, and probably our draw to the 3s, because the 3s would have made us a straight, and the aces would have made us 2 pair. And we thought all 3 of those hands, a 2 pair straight and a flush, would give us the best hand. Little did we know, though, that our opponent had pocket 6s. This took the 3s out of our equity, so we were asked to call something like 1 to 4, and we did call. And since we were asked to call 1 to 4, we've got 28% equity. It was a good call. The 6s were ahead, but the ace-king called, and we were last to act, and we decided, yes, we do need to call here. So it was a good call, given the fact that our 3s were not outs. But let's look at what other hands they could have had. So what if this guy didn't just have 6s? He had anything from 6s to kings, so he had a pocket pair. And then our ace-king player, he still had ace-king. So our equity before was 28%. Our equity now is 31%. That makes our hand even better because the 6s took our 3s away, and it doesn't matter if he's got 6s or kings for the rest of our outs. But in either situation, you know, we're good to call 1 to 4 given that our equity is where it's at. And so this is what understanding ranges can help you do. It can help you say, you know, I can't put you on a hand, but I can put you on a range. So if we go back to where we were at this exact situation, let's talk through the hand a little bit more. It was raised under the gun by this player to 4 times the big blind. Sorry, no, not under the gun, middle position. We were under the gun and we called. He raised to 4 times the big blind. Now, what kind of hands might you raise to 4 times the big blind? It'd probably look like something like that might be reasonable, maybe not the weaker aces. So let's take those off. You might raise a couple of pocket pairs too. Actually, no, I don't think this particular opponent would have. So 7s and better, and then some of these hands, probably not Queen 10, Queen 9 suited perhaps, King 9 suited maybe. But that looks like a pretty reasonable range. So that's his range. Our second player limped and then called. That could be a very wide range. It's impossible to pinpoint exactly where it is, but generally I use about 40% for a limp caller. So given their ranges before the flop, this is how we were to the flop. We were actually at about 62%, which is a pretty good reason to call before the flop, and that's why we did call. Now on the flop, or sorry, no, that is completely wrong. We're about 30%, so we're even with them. So that's a pretty good reason to call, and that's why we did call, getting about 4 to 1 on our money. Actually, there was another player who called and then folded. So we've got ace 4, and they've got 2 ranges. Now on the flop, the player who raised, which was this player here, he checked behind, and the flop, if you'll remember, was 4-2-2. So the question is, on that flop, what kind of hands might he check behind, and what would he bet? Well, I think he's going to bet aces, kings, queens, jacks, 10s, 9s, 8s, and 7s. Those hands have an overpair, and it's most likely that he would bet there to protect his equity. So we don't think he had any of those. He could have had any of the other hands, though. Those would be reasonable hands to check here. So we're going to take the pocket pairs out of his range. We're pretty confident he doesn't have any of those by the flop. And we can't evaluate the second player's range at all because all he did was check, and it got checked through, and he checks 100% of his hands, so that doesn't take any hands out of his range. Then the 5 comes. Okay, so let's look at where we are here. Here we're actually pretty significantly ahead. So let's look at where the 5 comes into play. At this point, what happened was, on the turn we bet 500 into a 1500 chip pot. This was essentially an attempt to set our own odds. We wanted to see the river card, but we didn't think we were ahead, but we still wanted to fold out 2 cards that might be over cards to ours. So it's a mixed bet. It's got some value in terms of our flush draw, and then it's got all the equity that we gain when this guy folds, say, King 9. So we bet there to make them do that. So that was a good bet. But then something strange happened. It got raised by the original player, the original raiser, this guy we've got right up right here. And he raised to about 2200, which puts him all in. And the other player, player 2, called the 2200 raise. So now the ranges have changed, because we had the original player who raised raised our bet. Now, what kind of hands might he raise our bet with? And in the video, which is under the Merging Ranges curriculum, we said that's a really weird time to raise because he didn't bet the flop. Because what we said was we knew that the high cards were, the pocket pairs were most likely out of his range. So the fact that he didn't bet the flop, we had already removed the high cards from his range. We assumed that his range looked something like this, and he was just making a really bad play. Okay? Player 2, though, is the interesting one. Player 2 called. Now, what hands might he have called an all-in with? It's not worth going through all of these cards and individually selecting them and taking them out. So what I usually do is just pull down to 0%. So I look at from 0%, and on this board, what might he have had all the way through that could call an all-in? Well, a 3-6 was out of our original range, so we're not going to include the 3-6. He could have a 2. There were some 2s in our range. So let's tick off the best 2s. The 2s he might limp call with. Actually, Queen 2 and King 2 are probably a little bit weak even for this guy, and they weren't in our initial range. So let's say Ace 2 and then some of the suited 2s. He could do this with an overpair, and we did have several of those in his range. So if he had aces or kings, that would be pretty poorly played. So we're going to take those out. But we're going to keep in, you know, all of the pocket pairs. Then he might be doing this with a 5. Of the 5s, the only ones that make sense to be in his range would be maybe 5-4. 6-4 could work. I doubt he played 7-4. Definitely didn't play 8-4. Might have played 7-4 suited. So we'll put 7-4 suited in his range just to be safe. He might be doing this with a 5, so he might have had 6-5 or 7-5. We don't think he had like a 4 here. That would be a really, really weird way to play a 4, to check and then call an all-in. Most people would fold it here. So we're going to take the 4s out of his range. That just doesn't make a lot of sense. Actually, we could put something like Ace 5 and Ace 4 into his range as long as they're suited, because he probably wouldn't have played them unsuited. Actually, no, if we're including Ace 2, we probably need to include Ace 4 and Ace 5. So those are potentials. If he's playing any ace, then he could have those in his range still. And of course, Ace 3 he could be playing with. But that's just about all the hands that would make sense to call here. So against his range, which is now this right here, we can hit evaluate and see where we are. And against that range, we're at 37%. Since we were calling with a sizable pot as well as 2 other players all in, we just needed to be about 30%, sorry, about 25% to make that call. We are actually 37.8%, and so that was a good call. The worst play, I believe, would be the all-in from Ace-King. That was a huge mistake. He had very few outs, and the fact of the matter is that he telegraphed his hand as being nothing when he checked the flop. So that was a pretty bad play, but by narrowing their ranges down, we were able to discern at the table that we had a call there, and then we were able to go into PokerStove after the game and prove it. So what else? So what else do we need to talk about regarding ranges? Well, let's talk about your c-bet range. Because when you c-bet, it's actually a really interesting look at how a range works. Because when I raise before the flop, I'm a pretty loose raiser. Let's talk about button raising. And I raise about 35% of my hands from the button. And I'm going to go in and include the pocket pairs. And I'm going to take out a couple of the weaker aces and probably some of the weaker cards here. But that looks like a pretty reasonable raising range for me. So about 32.7%. And let's say we had another player who called a raise, and let's say he calls about 40% of his hands. So something like that might be reasonable. Okay. So let's take the third player out for now. I'm not sure how to remove a player. Okay. So we've got a range and our opponent has a range. Let's look at, actually this range should include the 3s and 2s. So let's look at some boards where a c-bet might be reasonable. Let's talk about maybe a Queen 6, Queen D, 6D, 2D. This would be a dry board. Now, given that we're c-betting and we're both looking at ranges, we're pretty even on any board that comes out because we've got about the same range. The difference is some of his hands won't hit. And let's look at a specific hand that we might have that we might c-bet, like a King-Jack offsuit. So because a good chunk of his hands hit, he's going to have us beat when ours don't hit, which ours didn't. But even against the hands that did hit this flop, which would be any queen, any 6, and probably no deuces. So we're going to leave in, let's just pull this out. So we're going to say any pair over 6s as well as 6s and pocket 2s. Might be willing to call a c-bet. He might call a c-bet with ace-king. He'd definitely call it with any queen that he played. And he'd probably call it with any 6 that he played, which might be something like 6-5, yeah, maybe 7-6. Everything else he's going to fold. So let's look at this range compared to the range that he had. So before we put him on about 40% of his hands, sorry, I forgot to drag that back over. Before we put him on about 40% of his hands, but we can see here that only 14% of his hands hit. That means 14% of the time he's going to call or raises, but the other 26% of the time he's going to fold. So he's folding about 2 times as often as he's calling. That's why a c-bet makes sense, even when we don't have a hand, because he's going to fold so often. Because look at where his range is now, and look at where it was before. That was roughly the range we put him on, and only a few of these hands hit on this flop. So a c-bet on a dry flop just makes sense. Now let's change this up a little bit. Let's assume he still has the 40% calling range, but the flop comes something 8, 7, 3, and it's going to be suited. Now let's look at what hands in his range he might call this with. Well, he'd call it with the 3s, probably not with the 4s. And any pocket pair above 8s. So he might call, because it's a low flop, he might call with basically any 2 broadways. Probably take out King 10 and any kings that didn't hit. And probably take out all these kings except for the ones that didn't hit. Would he call with an ace? Only if it was 2 spades. So why don't we say ace 7, ace 8, ace 7, ace 8 or better, and then he's going to fold like he's going to call with jack 10 because that's got a gut shot. Jack 9's got a gut shot. 10-9, all these have gut shots. Probably fold queen 9, queen 10. Might fold queen jack. So something like 9-7 he could call, 10-7 could call, but anything weaker than that's probably going to be a fold. And all of these queens, they didn't hit. So now let's look at how this works on a dry board. This is, we're getting to a pretty reasonable range here. Sorry, on a wet board, he's called with 40%, but 26% of the time he's going to call on the flop. So this means that of the 40%, he's going to fold 13 and call 26. So it's completely the opposite of what we talked about on the dry board. Now he's calling more often than he's folding. That might lead you to believe, hey, never c-bet on a wet board. That's just not the case. For one, our king jack has some outs against even this range. If we look at it, we're still 26% to win even when he hits his hand pretty significantly. So we've got some equity there. But he also folds 13% of the time, which is about 33% of the times we bet. Now if we're c-betting half pot, he only has to fold 33% of the time to make this profitable, because 33% of the time we're going to lose our c-bet. Sorry, 66% of the time we're going to lose our c-bet. 33% of the time we're going to lose twice our c-bet, which is, we're going to win twice our c-bet, which is the size of the pot. So if we're betting half pot as a c-bet, we're breaking even on this, plus we have the additional equity. So we could probably go in and c-bet even on relatively wet flops. The times when a c-bet becomes nonsensical, though, is when we have a flop that absolutely smashes a player's range. So let's say we get called by a tight player, and a tight player is going to call you with pocket pairs, big broadways, and probably a couple of maybe something like that. So he's only calling you 16% of the time. We've got king jack, and if the board absolutely smashes his range with something like queen 9 8, then well, that's not really fair because we've got a semi bluff in there. Let's say ace 9 8. So against his range now, let's look at how we're doing. So we don't have any equity against the aces. We may have slight equity against the 9s and 8s, but it's suited, and we don't have any suited cards. And actually, let's make sure we don't have any suited cards. So he could have a spade in there. He could have an ace. He could be really, really hurting us. So given that, we know that he called with 16.7% of his hands, and he's going to call with, excluding all the spades, which is a good chunk of his hands, he's going to call with a lot of these. He's going to call with 8s and 9s, 10s, probably not. We've identified that he's typed. But these hands, they have draws, they have pairs. All the aces are going to call. King queen would probably fold. King jack would fold. But the rest of these probably have a good call. Now we've gone from 16% to 9.5%. So he's still calling with about 2/3 of his hands, ignoring the fact that he's going to call with all spades. So he's actually calling more than 2/3 of his hands. And at that point, you know, we're probably going to lose money c-betting here against this particular player. So the things you need to notice that are going to change whether or not you c-bet. Well, the first rule is you're generally going to c-bet. Probably 80% of your hands are going to c-bet, maybe more. But if his range is tight and the flop is high, that's definitely a sign not to c-bet. The tighter he is, the less likely you are to c-bet. Now this is very, it's kind of a paradox. You would think against a tighter opponent you get more money c-betting because they're going to fold more often. And if they're loose before the flop and tight after the flop, this is the case. But in this particular situation, we have a player who's tight before the flop and kind of loose after the flop. And against that kind of guy, you're going to lose a lot of money c-betting. So the tightness of your opponent and how wet or dry the board is. So those are the two things that you're going to consider when you decide to c-bet. So that'll cover the intro to ranges. Thank you for joining us at UPoker Academy. Please check us out on riskoriented.com for more poker strategy delivered directly to your YouTube account. Please like us and subscribe to us. And for more poker strategy right now, continue on to our next poker lecture by clicking here.